In this video, I will take you on a gentle journey through the faded memory of gods who once ruled the lives of millions, not from the heights of Olympus or the fires of Valhalla, but from the soft, sun-baked clay of the Tigris and Euphrates. These are not the loud, lightning-hurling deities of drama, but the slow, stern, and ever-watchful presences of ancient Mesopotamia. Gods whose names are now barely remembered, yet whose influence once reached into every meal, every breath. Tonight, we will walk slowly through forgotten temple courtyards and crumbling city walls. We will hear the whisper of rituals carved into stone tablets and pause beneath ziggurats built not to dazzle, but to mark order in the chaos of early cities. This is not mythology to awaken the mind, but to quiet it. Through the dim corridors of the past, we will visit the dust-covered duties of temple workers in Lagash, the fading legacy of Ningirsu of Girsu, the mystery of half-lost myths written on cracked clay, and the quiet lives of priests who served gods even kings feared. Let the hum of history settle around you now, softly, steadily, as we begin our descent into the deep and patient world of forgotten Mesopotamian divinity. You wake up before the sun, before the heat settles over the plain, before the city of Lagash stirs into sound. The night has not fully passed, and in this gray-blue half-light, you are already moving. You rise from the mat you share with your family, careful not to wake the others. It is your duty, your role, to be the first. You wash your hands and face in cold water from a clay jar. You do not speak. No one does. The silence is ritual. You pull on a linen tunic, rough against your skin, and tie your belt tight. Not for comfort, but for precision. Everything today must be done with care. You step into the street, a narrow, packed path between low houses made of baked mud. The smell of old ash, of goats, of morning sweat drifts in the breeze. You walk to the temple, your feet already familiar with the path, the pattern of stones beneath them. The ziggurat rises like a staircase to the sky, tiered and solemn, casting its wide shadow. It is not grand by modern standards, but it is heavy with importance. This is where the god dwells, not figuratively, but truly. You believe it, and so does everyone else. The god Ningirsu does not merely observe from the heavens. He lives here, in the innermost room, in the statue crafted by skilled hands, in the rituals that begin and end the day. You pass through the first gate, then another, and another, each one a threshold of purity. You have fasted since last evening. You have spoken no unnecessary words. You have cleansed yourself not for hygiene, but for spiritual clarity. Now you step into the antechamber, where your duties begin. The temple is quiet, but not empty. Others have come before you, scribes, guards, older servants, and there is a rhythm already underway, sweeping the dust with soft brushes made from date palm fronds. Preparing the altar cloth, checking the water basin. You are assigned to the kitchen today, not to cook for people, but for the god. His meal is symbolic, yet it must be real. You grind barley by hand, a slow, circular motion, stone against stone. Your fingers ache before the sun is even above the walls. You do not complain. Complaint is impiety. The flour is mixed with water. Kneaded without salt, gods must not be overstimulated, and baked in a clay oven that smokes but does not flame. The bread must not burn. If it burns, it is a sign. If it crumbles, a warning. When it is ready, it is placed on a reed mat beside fresh dates, onions, and a small bowl of beer, all carefully measured, all offered in silence. The statue of the god is turned toward the meal. It does not eat, of course, but the ritual assumes it does. Once the food has sat long enough to satisfy divine appetite, an hour, perhaps two, it is taken away. You do not eat it. That is for higher priests. You simply carry it out. You clean the vessels, you do not speak. You sweep the room again. You carry water up the ziggurat steps, carefully balancing it so none is spilled. You scrub the statue's base with cloth and cedar oil. You comb the lion mane of the bronze standard. You refill lamps with rendered fat. All of it slow. All of it watched. Not by others, always, but by the god, by the city's expectation of sacred routine. There is no shortcut. There is no innovation. The rituals are carved in tablets. The prayers are memorized. If you forget a line, you are replaced. If you drop a vessel, you are cursed. If you speak out of turn, it is considered a stain on the god's presence. You are not punished by men. You are simply no longer useful to the divine. This is not dramatic. It is just how it is. You are replaceable. The god is not. The day continues in this rhythm. Midday brings more sweeping, more carrying, more silent gestures. You assist the priest in interpreting the smoke of incense. Was it straight, or did it waver to the left? You write nothing. You record nothing. That is the scribe's duty. Yours is only to be present, perfectly, quietly, entirely. When the sun begins to lower and the bricks of the ziggurat turn amber, your body aches with effort. You have eaten only once, a handful of dried figs and a heel of bread in the courtyard. You do not drink until your tasks are finished. Evening brings another offering, another washing of hands, another recitation of names. The god has many names, and each must be pronounced correctly. You do not speak your own name today. That would be prideful. Only the god's name is spoken aloud. And then, as night begins to fall, you are dismissed. Not by voice, but by gesture. You bow. You step backward 3 times. You return home in darkness. You sleep with the knowledge that you must do it again tomorrow. Exactly the same, without flaw, without ego. You are not holy. You are a vessel of function. And in this, there is a strange peace, for your life has shape and duty and direction. But there is no joy. There is no room for error. And as you close your eyes, your dreams are filled with lists, not images, but instructions. For even asleep, your service to the god continues. The next day is the same, and the one after that, and the one after that. You begin to lose count of time, not by the moon, or the sun, or the festival days that come and go with slow, ritual certainty, but by the patterns of your labor, by how many times you VA scrubbed the same steps of the ziggurat, by how often you've set the same barley loaf before the same impassive statue. You no longer speak much, even when away from the temple. The silence has followed you home. Your neighbors, also temple workers, are quieter now too. It is not fear that quiets you. Not exactly, but a deep, ambient caution. As if every word must pass through the memory of the god before it can be spoken aloud. This is not a metaphor. In Lagash, the gods do not live in the sky, distant and abstract. They are here, now, tangible. You see their eyes in the polished obsidian inlays of their statues. You feel their breath in the cool shade of the sanctum. The lines between the material and the divine are so thin they feel like a film stretched over your thoughts. And so you do not curse. You do not laugh loudly. You do not make up songs or whistle or look at someone else's wife too long. You do not argue about price in the market, even when the lentils are short. The gods are always listening. There is no sin so small that it cannot stain your soul, and no ritual too repetitive to skip. Each act, the folding of the altar cloth, the relighting of the sacred lamp, the positioning of the food tray, is a petition for balance. Not just your own, but the city's. If you fail, the god may become displeased. The god is displeased, the harvest may fail. If the harvest fails, the people starve, and someone will trace it back to you. Not in anger, but in cold administrative logic. There are records. There are omens. There are omens for everything. If a dog gives birth in the temple courtyard, the storm comes early. If a particular kind of insect lands on the bread before it is offered, Each is read, interpreted, weighed. Your role in the temple is small, but its stakes are massive. And the weight of that awareness does not leave you, even in sleep. You find yourself dreaming not of family or of fields or of love, but of lists. The long chance. You must remember the sequence of oil pours the right order in which to place the 9 cups of grain before the shrine. One mistake and the whole day's balance may be lost. The scribe records your movements. The priest evaluates your silence. Your worth is not judged by character or kindness or cleverness, but by your ability to disappear into perfect performance. And this, somehow, becomes identity. You are not yourself. You are the task. You are not a man or woman with thoughts and hunger and dreams. You are the hand that sprinkles flour. You are the foot that steps backward 3 times. You are the breath that does not speak your name. This depersonalization is not called oppression. It is called order. And it has held Lagash together longer than you have lived. Sometimes you wonder who first made these rules. But such wondering is dangerous. It implies the rules are made, not eternal. And eternity in temple life is assumed. The tablets say so. The priest says so. The god does not speak. But if he did, he would say so too. You have seen what happens to those who deviate. A young servant once lit the incense with the wrong wood, tamarisk instead of cedar. The smell was sweet, but incorrect. The priest said nothing, but the servant was not there the next day. No one asked why. No one changed the subject. There is only one subject, the god, always the god. Even the architecture reminds you. The walls are lined with bricks stamped with the ruler's name, yes, but also with the name of the god. Every corner whispers a reminder. The god owns this place. The god owns this city. The god owns you. And yet, for all this weight, there is a comfort too. The structure cradles you. You know what each hour will bring. You know what each motion means. You do not have to invent purpose. It is assigned. You do not search for meaning. It is recited. And so the boredom becomes its own kind of peace, a sacred monotony, a holy fatigue. In time, you no longer dream of leaving the temple. The outside world feels jagged, unstructured. Inside, here, every step has a reason. Every breath is choreographed. And though it exhausts you, though it shrinks your soul into something compact and silent, it also holds you. In a world without stability, where floods come and go, where rulers rise and fall, where enemies press from all sides, the god does not change. The god is stone. The god is law. The god is routine. And in serving him, you are kept not safe, exactly, but intact. The temple is not a place of comfort, not in the sense that we now understand it. There are no cushions, no softness, no smiles exchanged between coworkers over shared struggle. It is cool in the mornings, yes, and dark in its deeper corridors, but the darkness is not restful. It is watchful. The air always smells faintly of ash, oil, and damp clay, a scent that lingers in your hair, your nails, your breath. You scrub it off at night, but it returns with the dawn. Every surface is rough. Every task demands total presence. There is no music. There is only rhythm, the shuffle of feet, the swish of robes, the drip of water into basins, the rustle of reed tablets being unwrapped. Read, rewrapped. These sounds become the only melodies you know, and they begin to loop in your mind even when you are away. At first, you resisted. Your thoughts wandered to memories, to small hopes. The scent of wet fields after rain, the taste of honey, the warmth of your sister's laughter. But these thoughts faded, one by one, replaced not by new memories, but by patterns. Sequences of chants, lines of prayer, temple measurements, and offerings. It is not that you forget who you were. It is that the temple slowly rewrites you, not by force, but by repetition. The god does not demand you change. The god simply waits, and the system does the rest. You become more careful in your posture. You move less quickly, but more precisely. You start waking before the first bell, not because you must, but because your body expects it. You begin to sleep in the same curled position each night, as if tucked into the clay molds used for votive figurines. You dream less, and when you do, it is always within temple walls, sometimes real, sometimes rearranged in that strange logic of sleep, but always governed by the same rules: silence, offering, balance, obedience. The god appears rarely, even in dreams. When he does not speak. He simply watches. That is enough. You are not a priest. You are not even a scribe. You are one of the many. The quiet, nameless figures who keep the rituals flowing like irrigation channels, unseen but essential. The temple has hundreds like you. And yet, each of you knows your absence would be felt. Not in mourning, but in malfunction. A lamp would remain unfilled, a stair uncleaned, a name unsaid, and the structure would tremble, if only slightly. You think of this sometimes, not with pride, but with a kind of solemn fear. That the only thing holding you in place is the work. That the only thing giving you weight in the world is the gravity of your repeated movements. Even your family sees you less. At meals, you speak little. At gatherings, you sit on the edge. Not because you are unwelcome, but because you are no longer fully of the world outside. Temple workers exist in a borderland. Not holy, but not entirely secular either. People look at you differently. Not with reverence, exactly, but with unease. You carry the scent of the god. You move with the god's cadence. You become, slowly, an extension of the temple itself, and yet your own sense of self has not vanished entirely. It flickers sometimes. In the moment when the first sunlight hits the statuesque face and you feel, against your better judgment, awe. In the second before you pour the water and you catch your own reflection in the bronze basin and wonder who you've become. In the late night walks back to your sleeping mat, when the stars above the ziggurat remind you that the god is not the sky, but something made by men to endure what the sky cannot. These thoughts come and go. You do not speak them. You would not know how. The language of doubt has no tablet, no approved liturgy. And so you tuck it away like a forbidden charm, and return your mind to the ritual. Clean the altar, fold the cloth, recite the line. Close the door behind you without turning your back. Always without turning your back. You were taught that from your first day. Never turn your back on the god. Never let the god see your spine. It is a sign of disrespect. No one remembers why, but no one forgets to obey. The god, after all, is eternal. You are not. There is no reward. This is something you come to accept. Eventually. There is no final ceremony, no celebration of service, no golden robe awarded at the end of a decade of quiet offerings. Your hands are not blessed. Your name is not carved into any wall. At best, your duty continues without interruption. At worst, you are replaced by someone younger, more precise, less inclined to blink too often during recitation. The temple does not need loyalty. It needs consistency. And the god does not notice you as an individual. The god notices whether the lamp is filled, whether the chant is correct, whether the steps are swept. If these things are done, the city is safe. If not, the god may leave. And so, you do not ask why. You do not wonder what it all means. You simply align yourself to the need, as a reed aligns to the river's pull. In this alignment, you begin to forget ambition. You forget comparison. You forget self. It is not painful, not in the way of a wound or a loss. It is quieter than that. You feel yourself dissolve gently, like incense smoke curling up the ziggurat stairs, unnoticed but still rising. You exist to maintain the invisible, the contract between the seen and the unseen. The god does not write contracts. The scribes do that. But the terms are clear. The god protects the city, and the city serves the god. You are the hand that serves, and your worth is equal to your precision. Sometimes, during seasonal festivals, the city swells with people, music, celebration. There are processions, painted masks, drums, flutes, shouting boys in the street. For a moment, the temple becomes the center of noise and spectacle. Offerings pour in: grain, oil, meat, garlands of flowers, tokens pressed with personal prayers. You assist with the sorting, the counting, the stacking of jars. You do not dance. You do not laugh. You do not watch the parade. You remain behind the threshold where the chants must still be perfect, the lamps still lit. Even in celebration, the god requires his rhythm. You wonder, briefly, what it would feel like to join the crowd. But the thought fades quickly, like a misstep in ritual you pretend never happened. The temple does not punish for thoughts, but you fear the thoughts themselves, not as sin, but as disruption. The worst thing you can be here is unstable. The worst sound is one that does not belong. So you speak only when needed. You smile only when instructed. You move like the god's breath, unseen, unchanging, essential. And in return, the god offers not love, not grace, not even acknowledgement. The god offers presence. That is all. The god is here, still watching. The statue does not blink. The statue does not age. The statue does not forget. And that is enough. Or so you tell yourself. You were not born into this role. You were chosen, or assigned, depending on who tells the story. Your father may have offered you as a vow. Or perhaps the priest noticed your silence, your obedience. Either way, the decision is in the past. And so it has become right. That is how the temple works. Once something has been repeated long enough, it becomes sacred. Your walk, your wash, your whispered prayer. They are sacred not because they are divine, but because they are unbroken. No one knows when these rituals began. No one asks. The tablets go back as far as memory. The god goes back farther. And so, you perform the same actions every day, with the same tools, the same chants, the same gestures, because it has always been done this way. You find a kind of tired holiness in this, a dusty, quiet reverence that is not emotional but structural. You do not cry in awe. You do not collapse in ecstasy. You simply complete the cycle. Again, again, and that cycle holds the city upright. The bricks of Lagash are mortared with routine. The fields grow because the god is satisfied. The king rules because the god's name is on his crown. And the god is satisfied because you, nameless, silent, exact, have placed the bread just so, recited the verse without pause, closed the curtain with both hands. You do not see this as power. You do not see this as servitude. You see it as the only way things stay whole. Outside the temple, the world changes. Kingdoms fall, storms come, borders shift. But inside, the same lamp burns. The same offering is made. The same God waits. And you, in your unending duty, are part of that waiting. You are not remembered. You are not recorded. You are not missed when you are gone. But for the days you serve, you are essential, not as a person, but as a pattern. And in a world of floods and famine, a pattern that does not break is more sacred than any name. Even as your fingers ache from carrying the same stone jugs, and your knees remember every stare of the ziggurat, and your shoulders hold the shape of burdens long since put down, you do not rebel. You do not wish for release. You do not dream of change. These are not just forbidden thoughts. They are incomprehensible ones because your world is not made of freedom or ambition, but of structure, duty, and sacred monotony. Change is not salvation, it is risk. And risk, in a temple, is the beginning of collapse. The god does not need emotion. He needs obedience. He does not bless uniqueness, he blesses alignment. And so you live as a stone in a wall, vital not because of what you are, but because of where you are placed. Your mornings begin before the sky shifts in the cool whisper of pre-dawn shadow. The bell rings, you rise. You do not stretch. You do not speak. You walk barefoot to the washing basin where the same water, cool and metallic, greets your face with indifference. Then, with robe straightened, hair tied back, and eyes lowered, you enter. Always the same sequence. Greet the sacred flame with a bow. Place the fresh reeds in the jar. Sweep the floor in concentric circles. Light the incense with cedar. Whisper the protective verse against demons of dust. Then proceed to the main chamber, a cavern of stillness where the statue of the god sits unmoving but not unfeeling. You do not look into its eyes. No one does. The eyes are set with shell and obsidian, and they seem to know things you do not. You move in their presence as you would move in a dream. Carefully, slowly, afraid to wake something not asleep but waiting. And the statue never changes. Its face is always slightly serene, slightly judging, slightly removed. You've watched it age not by cracking, but by staying the same as everything else around it decays. The god does not blink. The god does not age. You do. Your joints stiffen, your vision dims, your voice lowers with repetition. But the rituals do not adjust for you. You adjust to them. Each day becomes a carving in your body, a shallow groove of habit pressed deeper by repetition. Over time, even your thoughts begin to wear smooth. You stop wondering about the world beyond the city. You stop imagining other lives. You stop measuring the passing of years by anything other than festival cycles and the rate at which your sandals wear down. Sometimes new servants arrive, young, alert, full of questions they learn not to ask. You watch them fade too, over time, into the shape required. Their voices lower. Their eyes learn to avoid. Their steps begin to match yours. Unhurried, precise, quiet. There is no instruction manual. The temple does not train. It absorbs. And in doing so, it replaces your instincts with discipline, your dreams with rituals, your name with function. If you left, and you won't, but if you did, you would find the world strange. Too loud, too uncertain, too full of decision. Out there, you would have to choose who to be. In here, you simply are. A part. A motion. A presence in service to presence itself. The peace this brings is not joyful. It is not even restful. It is contained. That is the word. You are contained. Every outburst, every sorrow, every burst of laughter or love or hunger is sealed in the smooth lid of sacred behavior. You may cry once a year behind the storeroom curtain. You may remember your mother's song when folding the robes, but mostly you do not. Not because it is forbidden, but because it has no place. The temple has no place for spontaneity. The god has no appetite for personality. And so you become more and more like the objects you tend, steady, silent, symbolic. You exist not to be, but to mean. And the meaning is always the same. The god is here, and we are ordered. That is what your work says, in 1,000 small gestures. The god is here, and we are ordered. In this, you find purpose. In this, you surrender the burden of being anything else. And as the sun sets over the sandstone walls once more, casting long amber shadows that make the temple seem taller than it is, you place the final offerings before the god. Bow your head and leave. Not in haste, not in reflection, but in continuation. The day ends as it began, in quiet labor inside a machine built not of gears or iron, but of breath, clay, and belief. You are a servant. You are a symbol. You are part of a rhythm older than memory. And though your name will not be remembered, your steps will echo in the stillness. Not loudly, not forever, but just long enough for the god to notice and not disapprove. And so the days become years, but you do not measure them that way anymore. Years are a concept for those who move forward, who chart progress, who wait for change. In the temple, there is only cycle. One offering gives way to the next. One season of flooding gives way to another. The god does not change, and neither do you. Not really. Your body changes. Yes, your skin dries. Your back curves. Your voice grows quieter, as if it has finally learned to speak only what the god needs to hear. But your essence, the thing that once held your preferences, your habits, your stories, that softens like a clay tablet left too long in the sun. You are no longer a man or woman or child or elder. You are temple. You are function. You are rhythm. You do not resist this. In fact, on the rare days when a break-in routine occurs, an unexpected storm, a minor illness, a delay in incense shipment, you feel unease, not relief. You have become allergic to unpredictability. Your soul, if it still exists in its original shape, now prefers boundaries, repetition, order. When the new acolytes arrive, fresh from their homes, full of confusion and excitement, you do not speak to them. You observe them as you would observe a statue in progress, not yet cured, not yet shaped. They will learn. The temple will teach. And one day they too will shuffle without sound, bow without thought, and stare into the god's obsidian eyes without seeking an answer. You do not envy their youth. Youth requires desire, and desire is a luxury the temple does not permit. You remember a time, perhaps, when you longed for something more. A time when the stars above the courtyard pulled your thoughts upward, and you wondered about far-off places, different skies, but that was before the god settled into you. Not as a possession, not as a whispering voice, but as an architecture of being. The god did not invade your mind. The god shaped the walls of it. And now, even your thoughts trace sacred geometry, always returning to center, always forming the same arc. It is not submission, it is alignment. And in alignment, there is peace. Not the peace of still water or birdsong, but the peace of a rock that no longer wishes to roll. You do not know how long you've been here. You do not ask. Time is for the outside world. Inside, there is only the flow of duty, rising like mist at dawn, falling like shadow at dusk. The city around you changes. New kings rise. Laws are rewritten. Languages evolve. But inside these walls, the chant remains the same. You know it by heart, even if you no longer consider its meaning. You are the voice that carries it forward, not because you believe, not because you hope, but because it must be carried. And when your body finally fails, as all bodies must, there will be no funeral. The temple does not pause for its parts. Another will rise, take your place, match your steps, mimic your breath, and continue the song. You will be buried in the workers' field. A small tablet, perhaps, will mark your service. Or perhaps not. But the god will remain. The incense will rise. The lamp will be lit. And somewhere, at the base of the statue, a new pair of eyes will lower in reverence, not knowing your name, but walking your path. And that, in the end, is the closest thing to immortality you ever expected. Not remembrance, not glory, but repetition. The kind that keeps the world turning. The kind that pleases the god. The kind that never needed you, but was grateful you were willing to become part of it until you faded into the clay from which you once emerged dust in a temple, built to last longer than any life it quietly devours. This is a story without thunder. There is no cataclysm, no moment of divine rebellion or tragic fall. There is only a slow drift, a god once etched into the very breath of a city, quietly receding into silence. His name was Ningirsu. You will not find him in the great pantheons of the West, nor carved into the popular imagination beside thunderbolts and sun chariots. But for the people of Girsu, a once thriving city-state nestled between the life veins of the Tigris and Euphrates, Ningirsu was everything. He was war and water, storm and structure, strength and sovereignty. His temple was not just a place of worship, but a hub of governance, the literal and metaphysical center of the city's order. Where the god sat, so too sat justice, kingship, irrigation, ritual. He was not distant. He was present. And yet, today, you do not hear his name. Not because he was defeated, but because he was absorbed. By time, by politics, by progress. He faded not with a cry, but with the careful placement of another brick, another seal, another name above his own. In the early days, when Girsu was rising from mud and reeds, Ningirsu was more than protector. He was infrastructure. The god was invoked not merely for battle, though he bore the mace and the lion-headed eagle, but for canal digging, land measurement, and record keeping. He was the god of controlled violence, the kind that clears a path, carves a channel, maintains a border. His warriors marched not only for conquest, but for order. When kings of Lagash claimed territory or quelled rebellion, it was in Ningirsu's name. But he did not only conquer, he supervised, he measured, he legitimized. His temple, the Aninyu, the House of 50, stood as a monument not just to piety, but to bureaucracy, and that was part of his power. Ningirsu was not wild. He was not unpredictable. He was strong in the way that walls are strong, built by calculation, unyielding through structure. And Girsu loved him for that. Every tablet discovered from the city hums with his presence. Legal codes invoke him. Oaths are sworn by him. The king does not act without first kneeling to him. Even the canals, life-bringing arteries through Mesopotamia's brittle soil, are sacred to him. And yet, as centuries passed, his identity began to thin. His attributes were not lost, but merged, filtered through the shifting lens of political consolidation. As Lagash expanded and later diminished, Ningirsu became less a singular presence and more a local flavor of a broader divine template. His warlike aspects blurred into those of Ninurta. His administrative clarity became Lugalbanda's wisdom. His protective ferocity echoed in Enlil's cosmic authority. And still, his temple stood. Still, offerings were made. Still, scribes inked his name. But something had changed. Not in the rituals, but in their resonance. The god was no longer the center. He was a symbol of former centrality. The Aninyu became a monument to what Girsu had been, rather than what it was. The city still functioned. The rituals still echoed. But the vitality, the pulsing immediacy of belief, that had dimmed. You can see this slow erosion in the tablets. Early inscriptions shout Ningirsu's name in royal proclamation. Later, ones list him quietly, second or third. His temple's accounts become increasingly formulaic, less dynamic. New rulers begin favoring broader, more politically useful deities. And so, Ningirsu, who once roared as the lion-headed eagle, who once broke enemies and cleared floodwaters, begins to settle into brick. Not dead, not even forgotten. Just background. Architectural, foundational. The god remains. But only in the way old laws remain. Referenced, respected, but no longer living. In this, Ningirsu becomes something rare among deities. A god who did not fall, but was filed away. And perhaps that is a fate more unsettling than oblivion. To endure not as a story, but as a system. To become part of the mortar that holds up other names. To exist not in worship, but in quiet permanence. A corner block. A forgotten keystone. The divine turned administrative. The storm god folded into statute. And Girsu, the city he shaped, echoes his silence. The temples are ruins now. The tablets, mostly unearthed by foreign hands, are studied not as sacred, but as historical. And yet, when you read them, when you follow the cuneiform lines that curl like riverbeds, you can feel him. Not as a voice, not even as a memory, but as a rhythm. The rhythm of order built slowly, upheld fiercely, and left standing long after the crowd has moved on. Ningirsu does not ask to be remembered. He does not punish forgetfulness. He does not demand. He remains. And in remaining, he teaches something that louder gods cannot, that permanence is not about glory. It is about integration. The gods who last are not those who dazzle. They are those who become indistinguishable from the walls around them, quiet, massive, unyielding, like the bricks of a city long buried, but still exactly where they were placed. To understand Ningirsu, you must understand the way kingship worked in Girsu. Unlike later empires that exalted rulers as semi-divine beings, the Sumerian city-states operated on a more reciprocal model, one where the king was not divine, but divinely authorized. That authorization did not come through dramatic miracles or celestial omens alone. It came through architecture, through ritual, through administrative consistency, through the favor of a god like Ningirsu, who did not demand spectacle, but insisted on precision. When a king of Lagash entered his reign, the first task was not conquest, but construction. He had to restore, expand, or refurbish the temple of Ningirsu, the inn anew, and in doing so, demonstrate his alignment with the divine order. The temple was both palace and document, a built contract between human ruler and divine overlord. Its foundation tablets, buried beneath layers of brick, were not merely inscriptions. They were legally binding spiritual acknowledgments. And Ningirsu was always present in these restorations. In every phase, every level of architecture, his name returned. Not necessarily louder, but always foundational. To ignore Ningirsu in Girsu was to ignore gravity. It would mean a kingdom without center, a law without source. Yet over time, that centrality began to feel more inherited than invoked. Kings mentioned him because they had to. They restored the Inenu because precedent demanded it. Devotion blurred into obligation. Worship flattened into protocol. The god who once roared in inscriptions now muttered in form letters. Still sacred, but sacred in the way a seal is sacred or a ledger. Not because it inspires, but because it maintains. And so the function remained while the flame dimmed. As dynasties rose and fell, new gods gained currency. Enlil with his cosmic authority, Inanna with her dangerous glamour, Marduk with his political ascendancy. Ningirsu did not contest this. He was not erased, merely recontextualized, folded into new stories, renamed in later traditions. His symbol, the lion-headed eagle, appeared elsewhere, detached from its origin. His attributes echoed in inertia, often indistinguishably. And Girsu itself, the beating heart of his cult, faded from prominence. Other cities drew the scribes, the soldiers, the songs. And yet, in the archaeological layers, Ningirsu remains persistent. His name is etched not in grand declarations, but in mundane ledgers. Grain tallies, labor rosters, canal assignments. In this, he becomes something more haunting than a forgotten god. He becomes a remembered system, a divine presence whose true identity is lost beneath the repetition of usage. Ask a late-period scribe why the ritual is performed, and he might shrug. Because it has always been so. That phrase, a shield against forgetting, is ironically how forgetting begins. The practice remains, but the meaning recedes. Like a building whose original blueprint is lost, yet still stands, repurposed. You pass through the corridors of belief, still sweeping, still bowing, but not knowing why. And Ningirsu becomes the god of such corridors. Silent, structural, unquestioned. There is no rebellion in his decline, no martyrdom, no tragedy. His silence is not surrender, but saturation. He is everywhere in Girsu, even as no one sees him anymore. He has become the color of the stone, the angle of the wall, the way the door opens during ceremonies. And in this, there is a strange triumph. Most gods rage against irrelevance. They demand sacrifice, revival, remembrance. But Ningirsu never needed to be remembered, only to be embedded. And embedded he was, not in heart, but in habit. When modern archaeologists uncovered Girsu, it was not through tales or myths. It was through brickwork, layer upon layer of methodical, bureaucratic brickwork. And at the center of this administrative density, they found him. Not on a throne, but on a tablet. Not proclaimed in poetry, but listed in an inventory. The god who once ruled the storms, now ruled the ledgers. And yet, even in this form, something of his presence lingers. A strength that does not come from flash or fury, but from endurance. A sense that some gods do not fade because they were defeated, but because they were too successfully woven into the systems they upheld. And perhaps this is the quiet cost of being truly foundational. You are never remembered for what you were, only for what you supported. In the end, the name survives, but as echo, not invocation, as footnote, not headline. And maybe that is enough. Maybe a god like Ningirsu, who shaped the very logic of a city, does not need worship to exist. He needs only brick, and those willing to follow the pathways he once laid, even if they no longer know why. There is a symbol that once stirred awe. The Anzu bird, fierce and magnificent, a hybrid of chaos and control. Its lion's head roared with terrestrial dominance, while its eagle wings stretched skyward, suggesting divinity in motion. In Ningirsu's iconography, the Anzu was not simply an emblem. It was an extension of his very nature, the union of ferocity and surveillance, earth and air, king and storm. The Anzu did not merely sit beside Ningirsu. It acted for him, enforced his will, guarded his temple. Its shape was carved into boundary stones, stamped on royal seals, painted onto temple walls. It was everywhere that power needed reminding. And yet, over time, it became less about power and more about pattern. You see this in the changing forms of the image. Early depictions are vivid, dynamic. The Anzu in flight, claws extended, maw open in sacred rage. Later versions appear stiff, schematic, confined to the margins. The movement is gone. The purpose is muted. The symbol remains, but it's referent. Ningirsu's living presence has become abstract, and still it's drawn. Still it's etched. Still it's copied. Not because it stirs anything, but because tradition demands it. And so a divine creature once feared becomes a decorative motif. It is replicated in the same way one might replicate the border of a tablet. Not for meaning, but for symmetry. The god's identity, once inseparable from this living, breathing myth creature, now resides in its silhouette. And the silhouette, drained of narrative, becomes ritual wallpaper. This is how belief calcifies. Not with the cessation of ritual, but with its overuse. With each unthinking replication, the Anzu's roar grows quieter. The line between myth and ornament blurs. It is not that people stop believing. It is that they forget what belief once felt like. They remember the steps, but not the dance. And so they march, unknowing, through temples adorned with fierce birds that no longer guard anything but dust. And in this silent transformation, Ningirsu becomes less a god and more a guideline, a template, a standard to be followed in form, but not spirit. He becomes a requirement in ceremonies that no longer feel sacred, a box to be checked, a word to be recited. His name appears in contracts, not prayers, in canal maintenance schedules, not poetry, in tax records, not lamentations. He has been domesticated by his own success, made so essential to order that order forgot he was once a storm. And perhaps that is the great irony, that the god of strength, of battle and boundaries, of divine will enacted through precision, was undone not by rebellion, not by blasphemy, but by compliance, by endless repetition, by being made so integral that he disappeared into the very systems he supported. The more they built with his name, the less they saw him. The more they invoked his protection, the less they imagined his presence. And still, the Anzu hangs above temple doors, its wings outstretched, eyes wide, mouth open. But no one looks up, no one asks. The form is preserved, but the fear is gone. The awe has turned to aesthetic. And in that transition, Ningirsu's divine image, once electrifying, becomes decorative brickwork, a flourish, a trace. The ghost of meaning in a city that remembers every ritual but forgets why they began. It is in this space, this tension between presence and emptiness, that Ningirsu endures. Not as a god who speaks, but as one who is spoken about, written around, honored in gestures drained of urgency. His decline is not decay, it is overuse. His disappearance is not destruction. It is overfamiliarity. And that, perhaps, is the softest erasure of all. To be so accepted that no one notices when you no longer truly there. Ningirsu's divinity did not only live in stone, but in the rhythm of time. In the planting cycles, the calendar rites, the carefully aligned offerings that marked the passing of seasons as much as they reaffirmed belief. His temple, the Inenyu, was not merely a shrine, it was a schedule. Within its walls, scribes recorded not just sacrifices and hymns, but grain deliveries, labor rotations, ceremonial renewals. And through this rhythm, the people of Girsu came to experience Ningirsu, not as a distant thunderer, but as a kind of sacred bureaucracy, a divine heartbeat you could measure by the weight of barley, the width of irrigation channels, the turning of lunar months. He was not above daily life, he was daily life. His rituals marked the start of workdays, the calculation of taxes, the rotation of tasks. And in this steady weaving of the sacred and the mundane, belief transformed. No longer did it require awe. It required compliance. It required ticking off the divine checklist. Offer on the 15th day. Done. Clean the canal for festival preparation. Scheduled. Send the fourth son to assist the temple kitchens. Noted. And so belief became administration. Faith became a function of memory. And Ningirsu, once a god of commanding presence, became a quiet obligation. The people did not cease to revere him. They ceased to wonder. The temple still buzzed with activity. Incense still curled into the air. Priests still chanted names, offerings still steamed on altars. But the rhythm no longer pulsed with vitality. It ticked like a clock. The god was still honored, but in the way one honors a routine. And yet, this transformation did not diminish his presence. It deepened it. For even as Girsu changed, as dynasties rose and fell, as rival cities claimed supremacy and new deities captured the imagination of elites, Ningirsu remained embedded in the tempo of the town. His festival days were still market days. His temple gates still served as points of announcement, arbitration, proclamation. His priests still stood at the intersection of the sacred and the legal. And so, paradoxically, the god who faded from prominence endured longer than those who shone more brightly. He became useful, and usefulness survives longer than reverence. Generations passed. Scribal hands changed. The dialects evolved. Borders shifted, but the records stayed steady. The rituals repeated. The same festivals were named, the same prayers murmured, the same logs kept. Not because of fiery conviction, but because they worked. Because they were part of the system. And Ningirsu, whether truly present or not, was a necessary part of the machine. And in this quiet embedding, a new form of divinity took shape. The god not of miracles, but of structure. The god whose temple stood not for glory, but for order. And as the centuries wore on, even that order began to fade. Not through destruction, but through disuse. The canals silted. The tablets broke. The names smudged. The city's heartbeat slowed. But still, when the archaeologists came, dusty, determined, distant in time but hungry for echoes, they found Ningirsu's world more intact than most. Not in majesty, but in consistency. Not in myth, but in inventory. And in these records, they began to reconstruct not just a religion, but a rhythm. A daily life steeped in obligation, ritual, respect, and repetition. And there Ningirsu was, not roaring from the heavens, but lingering in footnotes, floating in formulas, tucked into the corners of legal texts. The god who had become a habit. And perhaps, in a world where belief often flares and fades, that is the most enduring kind of power. Not to dazzle, not to terrify, but to be written into the very architecture of routine. To be so foundational that forgetting is impossible, not because people remember you with passion, but because they cannot function without your imprint. Ningirsu may not have survived in hymns or legends, but he survived in logistics. And in that survival, there is a quiet divinity, the kind that does not ask for prayer, only process. And so the temple stood, and the people passed through its halls, day after day, generation after generation. Not as pilgrims seeking divine favor, but as citizens fulfilling expectation. Fulfilling duty, fulfilling what was etched into the stone long before their births. The Aninyu was no longer a house of awe, but a calendar in clay. A warehouse of ritual and remembrance. A place where people did not raise their eyes in fear or hope, but instead lowered their heads in deference to tradition, to habit, to what had always been. And within that structure, both physical and psychological Ningirsu endured. Not as a voice that boomed from the heavens or whispered in dreams, but as a presence felt in the weight of stone, in the placement of each stair. In the measured walkways that led to the altar that no longer needed to blaze with sacrifice, because it had already been consecrated by time by endless feet crossing the same threshold. His divinity became spatial, architectural. One could measure belief in bricks and ratios in the silent lines of Sumerian cuneiform that recorded when the festival began. How much barley was stored, how many oxen were prepared for ritual, and how many young men served at the gate. In this way, Ningirsu became not just god of storms, not just warlike protector of canals and boundaries, but the quiet sovereign of institutional memory. His temple was not a dwelling for a deity, but a container for continuity. And continuity is the slowest form of worship's subtle, persistent, unspectacular. When you walked through the courtyards of the Aninyu, you didn't look for miracles. You looked for records. You found rows of tablets filed meticulously. Their marks not prayers, but confirmations. Offerings made, labor allocated, disputes resolved. Each entry a quiet invocation of Ningirsu's authority, not as myth, but as order. The gods who survived in legend often had chaos attached to them, thunderous births, dramatic transformations, tales that leaped across dynasties like sparks. Ningirsu had no such flamboyant afterlife. His survival was the survival of masonry, of administration, of civic rhythm. And in that survival, he became harder to erase than any myth. Because to erase Ningirsu would have meant tearing down the very procedures that kept Girsu alive. His sacredness was procedural. His power, procedural. And so he lingered not in songs, but in how the city was swept, how decisions were made, how canals were redirected. The rituals persisted not because they thrilled, but because they worked. The stone was replaced when worn, the names recopied when smudged. The offerings weighed not for spiritual effect, but to match last year's inventory. He was, at this point, less a personality than a standard. And still, in this lifeless repetition, he haunted the spaces. He was there in the quiet confidence of temple scribes, in the certainty of the priest who recited words he did not translate, In the rhythm of ceremonies whose origins were no longer questioned, no child asked why the ritual was performed. Etc. No elder explained. It simply was. And that was belief's most unshakable form, not belief that is felt, but belief that is assumed, ambient, undisturbed. The walls held his name. The ground bore his shape. The temple functioned like a lung. Inhale the people. Exhale the rhythm of their lives, and Ningirsu was that rhythm, even if he no longer had voice or face. And when Girsu finally declined, not from invasion, but from irrelevance, from economic drift, from the slow rechanneling of trade and power, it was not a cataclysm that silenced the god. It was wind, dust, time. The walls crumbled, not from fury, but from disuse. The name faded, not from heresy, but from disinterest. And yet, when the archaeologists came, they found him. Not in the way we imagine gods to be found in statues or stained glass, in epic verse, but in ledger tablets, in canal records, in the alignment of bricks. His name, once called out in storm and battle, was pressed into the quiet of clay receipts. And through those he returned not as thunder, but as trace. And it is this trace that tells us more about ancient belief than any epic. Because what Ningirsu represents is not the flash of divine power, but its sedimentation, its burial in layers of repetition. He was not forgotten, because to forget him would be to forget how to function, and so he endured as functionality itself. A god no longer prayed to, yet still obeyed. A name no longer loved, but still invoked. A presence no longer vibrant, but still foundational. And perhaps this is the most honest version of deity humanity has ever produced. Not the all-powerful protector, not the wrathful skyfather, not the miracle worker or the bringer of fire, but the one who simply remains, because to remove him would be to remove the framework of things. Ningirsu was no longer worshipped in the heart, but in the habit. And in the end, habit may outlive devotion. In the dry heat of southern Iraq, near the banks of what was once a thriving waterway, the buried city of Girsu waited not with urgency, not with promise, but with patience. Beneath mounds of sand and silence lay layers of baked brick, of shattered pottery, of tablets pressed with wedge-shaped signs that hadn't been read in 3,000 years. And when the archaeologists finally arrived, their tools were delicate, their pace slow. But what they uncovered was neither majestic nor miraculous. It was procedural, row upon row of administrative records, temple inventories, grain allotments, canal tax receipts, and among them, a name that recurred not at the top of hymns. Not crowning royal edicts, but tucked into line items and footnotes. Ningirsu, the god of Girsu, the storm god of Lagash, the once mighty patron of a city that had long since become nothing but a tell, a mound. His name wasn't shouted, it was noted. And yet, that frequency of notation was louder, in a way, than any epic could be. Because what it revealed was not just his existence, but his utility. Ningirsu had not been worshipped for inspiration or redemption or transcendence. He had been used, woven into the city's logistics, etched into its rituals, embedded in its expectations. And in this way, the archaeologists realized they weren't discovering a god as much as a system. They weren't uncovering belief, but infrastructure. The Aninu was not a temple in the romantic sense, but an archive, and its god was its signature. The act of writing his name again and again, not in adoration, but in accounting, preserved him far beyond the lifespan of his stories. And so Ningirsu re-emerged, not in grandeur, but in repetition. The dig team sifted through layers, matching tablet fragments like puzzle pieces, reconstructing timelines from broken corners, decoding names from dusty glyphs. Each recovered tablet added another heartbeat to the god's long-buried rhythm. They could map when festivals had shifted, when offerings were reduced, when droughts had demanded new rituals. They could see how Ningirsu's duties expanded or contracted, depending on the economic pressures of the city. They saw his authority shrink during famine, rise during war, stabilized during long harvests. He was a barometer, not just a deity. And in this emerging portrait, the god became more than myth. He became evidence. Evidence of how belief becomes structure, how the divine becomes administrative, and how, in the long arc of human history, endurance is often less about brilliance than about integration. Gods who blazed brightly were often quickly extinguished. But Ningirsu, who folded himself into the habits of a city, survived in the margins. His memory lived on, not in legends, but in ledgers. And today, those ledgers are prized not for their poetry, but for their detail. Historians reconstruct temple economies, canal maintenance, tax structures, political alliances, all because Ningirsu's name was attached to the paper trail. He was the seal at the bottom of the tablet, the first line in a list, the repeated phrase in a ritual clause. And in this way, he teaches us something subtle but profound, that the divine is not always thunderous, not always transcendent. Sometimes it is quiet, thorough, and persistent. Sometimes it is found not in the sky, but in the bricks beneath our feet. Ningirsu's survival offers a mirror to our own modern institutions. How many of our most powerful systems operate not through passion, but procedure? How many beliefs today are carried forward, not because they are loved, but because they are baked into habit? The lesson of Ningirsu is not one of decline, but of transformation. He did not vanish, he was absorbed, diffused into the everyday, lost not in fire, but in formality. And when he was unearthed, thousands of years later, the question was not, who is this god? But what does his persistence say about the people who invoked him? The archaeologists, poring over fragments under harsh sun and slow months, did not discover a deity. They discovered a discipline. And perhaps that is the most enduring kind of power, the kind you daren't notice until you try to function without it. Ningirsu's return is not a revival, but a recognition that history remembers not only the spectacular, but the consistent, not only the conqueror, but the clerk, not only the hymns, but the headers of inventory lists. And so he rises, brick by brick, ledger by ledger, from the soil not as a roaring god of tempest, but as the shape of endurance itself. So here we are in a world where belief wears different clothes, where gods no longer live in ziggurats or canal-side shrines, but in metaphors and management systems, in routines and records and assumptions so old we forget they once began as choices. And yet Ningirsu, the storm god of Girsu, the divine bureaucrat, the brick-bound deity of barley and battle and boundary, persists in ways that outlive his epics. He lives in the concept of structure, in our longing to make sense of complexity through ritual, to impose order on uncertainty through repetition. His name may not stir the heart, but it stirs the silt. His shrine may not summon the faithful, but it summons the patient hand of the archaeologist. Brushing dust from the idea that belief was ever anything but embedded in the human need for routine, Ningirsu reminds us that not all divinity is dazzling. Some of it is slow. Some of it is heavy. Some of it is carved in clay so many times that it becomes indistinguishable from the system it serves. And maybe that's the point. That endurance is its own miracle. The God who faded into brickwork teaches us that reverence can be silent. That gods do not need to demand devotion if they already command structure. And that faith, when repeated long enough, becomes indistinguishable from function. It is easy to forget such a God. Easy, too, to rediscover him, not in awe, but in familiarity, in the feeling that some part of you already knew his rhythm, already lived by a calendar not so different from his, already trusted in systems that made the world predictable, survivable, shareable. Today, we might not offer barley or sing odes, but we still believe in institutions. We still build our days around invisible powers, protocols, policies, standards. The soul of Ningirsu lingers in every bureaucratic temple, in city councils, in fiscal years, in ceremonial inaugurations whose origins few remember but whose shapes we still obey. And in this way, Ningirsu has become one of the most modern of ancient gods. Not a relic of irrationality, but a reminder that belief and organization are not opposites. That faith, at its core, may be less about ecstasy than about agreement. Less about thunder, more about thresholds. And so, when we walk through modern cities, past the monuments and municipal buildings, past the quiet grind of administration that keeps roads paved, records filed, water flowing, we are closer to Girsu than we think. We, too, live within temples of routine. We, too, enact rituals without knowing the source. And when we forget why we do what we do, when the origins are lost but the motions persist, we are, in a sense, worshipping like Girsu did in its last days, not through fervor, but through function. And in this, Ningirsu is not dead. He is simply diffused into every system that outlasts its story, into every belief that survives not because it is felt, but because it is needed, into every place where people gather to do what has always been done. The god who faded into brickwork never left. He became the brick, and in that quiet transmutation, he has endured longer than flame. In this segment, we descend into the soil of forgotten cities, tracing the ancient breath of myth through fragments of clay and ritual. We will explore the vanished pantheons, silent processions, and encoded rites of the world's first urban civilizations, not in what was remembered, but in what was lost, buried, or left undeciphered. Tablets in the Dust takes you through the once thriving cities of early Mesopotamia, from Eridu to Uruk, where temple songs were etched in cuneiform and divine presence was measured in grain, smoke, and silence. These are the myths that didn't make it. Broken tales found on shattered tablets, rituals cut off mid-sentence, gods with no names and names with no stories. Here, divinity wasn't majestic, it was municipal. Myth wasn't entertainment, it was structure. We'll look at the overlooked temple storage lists that hint at gods now forgotten, calendrical rituals whose meaning outlasted their memory, cities where the line between citizen and priest blurred beneath the dust. As always, this will be a soft ascent, calm, detailed, and steady. Nothing to startle you, nothing to keep you awake. Just the gentle excavation of a world that once was, and that shaped the one you live in now, in ways you've never been told. Let us begin with the dust, the tablet, and the silence between. The first cities were not born with walls or kings, but with gathering slow accumulations of people around wells, rivers, and the whisper of harvests. Before monuments, before statues of gods or emblems of power, there were simply places where humans stayed. And from that, staying came rhythm. The rhythm of mornings and markets, of seasonal returns and annual floods, of hunger and hope. And from rhythm came repetition. And from repetition, memory. And from memory, myth. Not the myth of heroes or monsters, not yet, but the myth of why the seed sprouted, why the storm came, why the sun rose. The cities of Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur were not first famous for their kings, but for their temples. And the temples were not cathedrals, they were storage centers, granaries, bureaucratic hubs. They were divine because they organized the unpredictable. Their gods were not yet fully formed personas. They were forces given names so they could be spoken to. And what we have left of these early beliefs is not poetry, but process. Thousands of clay tablets, stored or discarded in layers of dust, tell of sacrifices offered, rites scheduled. Lunar cycles track not in metaphors, but in numbers, in measurements. There were gods for bricks, gods for reeds, gods for each bend of the river. The divine was everywhere because life was fragile, and anything that helped sustain it was made sacred. The tablet was the medium not of story, but of survival. Yet within these dry records are hints of something else, references to songs no longer sung. Two rituals performed without explanation, two deities whose functions are listed but whose faces are unknown. One tablet might list 37 deities to be honored during the harvest, only 10 of whom appear in any other known text. Who were the rest? Spirits of local fields, names too regional to endure, or parts of a ritual sequence lost to time where the name mattered only in a particular cadence, in a particular chant, long since silenced. Imagine yourself in a temple courtyard, not grand, but functional. Clay incense burners line the wall. The air smells of dust, ash, and oil. A priest, not in gold, but in linen smeared with ash reeds from a tablet, not aloud, but under his breath, ensuring each syllable is recited exactly. A misstep is not a sin, it is a disruption. The gods of these cities did not demand love. They demanded alignment. Calendars were divine instruments. The full moon meant one thing, the new moon another. Fields were not just plowed, they were purified. Bread was not just baked, was consecrated. But this consecration was not romantic. It was rote. What mattered was not feeling, but form. The earliest myths may have been born not in wonder, but in necessity. To remember when to dig canals, to know how to store barley, to keep track of debts, seasons, days. And so the first myths may not have sounded like stories at all. They may have sounded like instructions. The gods, as recorded, had functions more than feelings. Enlil controlled wind and kingship. Inanna held fertility and warfare. Ningirsu governed storm and irrigation. But what of Nanch, goddess of divination and social justice? Her rites are mentioned in passing down festival tallies in temple rosters. But the texts that explained her stories are gone. We have her name, her domain, her association with fish and marshes. But the myth? Lost. She is a silhouette traced in ink and clay. Multiply her by hundreds. Because for every major god we know, there were dozens more for whom we have only a name, a ritual, a role. In Lagash records list daily offerings made to lesser deities, many of whom appear nowhere else in the historical corpus. Were they local gods? Temporary ones? Aspects of larger deities, given distinct names in specific ceremonies, we don't know. And in that not knowing lies the heart of this segment. These were myths without continuity, rituals without revival, gods without biography, and yet they ruled the daily lives of thousands, not through inspiration, but through instruction. When the wind blew wrong, they were blamed. When the rain came late, they were petitioned. Their absence was noticed only when systems failed. And that made them no less powerful, only less visible to history. The myths that survived were those that thrilled, the ones that burned in imagination. But the ones that mattered, truly, to the people who lived by them, were often dull, detailed, and dependable. A ritual for clearing the threshing floor, a chant for setting boundaries, a sequence of libations for each day of the 7-day market cycle. These are not stories modern ears lean in to hear. But for the people of Uruk, they were sacred rhythms, and the gods who received them, though forgotten, were once as real as rain. To live in an early Mesopotamian city was to live in a landscape that did not distinguish between the sacred and the civic. The temple was the storehouse, the office, the school, the sanctuary. It was where you brought your barley, where you learned your syllabary, where you watched the heavens, where you learned to wait. It was not a place to visit once a week in ceremony. It was the heart of the city, and sometimes the city itself. The god whose name adorned its doorways was not an abstract presence, but a manager, a calendar keeper, an accountant of the sacred. And the people who served that god, the priests, the scribes, the gatekeepers, did not simply recite. They recorded. With styluses pressed into clay and fingers worn with repetition, they built layers of myth, not through imagination, but through administration. The myth lived in the record, but these were not tales told for entertainment. They were formulas, linguistic structures to bind the world to order. A ritual might begin with a simple phrase. On the 4th day of the month of Nisanu, at the hour of sunrise, let the grain be offered. From that beginning, a sequence would unfold. Measurements, placements, invocations. If one part was forgotten, the cycle frayed. And so, tablets were copied not once, but dozens of times across generations. But clay is fragile. Cities fall. Shelves burn. What remains are fragments, often bottom corners or title lines, from which we reconstruct echoes. One such fragment, discovered in Nippur, lists the names of 8 deities associated with the brewing of beer. Not drinking it, not celebrating with it, brewing it. Each step had its own divine overseer. One for the barley mashing, one for the fermentation vessel, one for the sealing of the jug. What this tells us is not simply that the Sumerians loved beer, though they did. It tells us that every act was sacred, but only if done properly. And properness required names, order, invocation. The gods lived in the margins of labor. Imagine a young apprentice learning to make bread. Not from a recipe, but from recitation. Say the name of Nizuba before kneading. Offer a crumb to Nintu before baking. These were not superstitions, but protocols. They formed a scaffolding that made life intelligible. You did not have to believe that God would bless the loaf. You simply had to do what your ancestors had done, because it had always worked. The ritual was memory made action. The myth was repetition given shape. And the temple, the sacred complex where all this was coordinated, was not only a building, but a timetable. Its walls bore engravings of solar movements, its courtyards aligned with equinoxes, its basins used to calculate water flow for irrigation. It was science and spirit, unseparated. Its priests were neither prophets nor philosophers. They were technicians, custodians of cycle. And so when we find tablets that speak of rituals now lost, offerings to a god whose name appears only once in all known records, we are not discovering strange beliefs. We are discovering missing pieces of systems. A ritual for a marsh-dwelling spirit might have been conducted every year for 300 years, and then stopped. Why? Perhaps the marsh dried up. Perhaps the festival calendar was revised. Perhaps the god was folded into a larger deity and renamed. And with that, the ritual ceased. The story, if it ever existed, was not retold. It did not die with a bang. It faded with a shrug. And yet, it mattered once. Enough to warrant scribal labor. Enough to receive an entry in a long ledger. Enough to shape a person's morning. To chant a name before stepping into the river. To whisper a phrase before opening the grain bin. These are not myths that stir the imagination, but they stirred the rhythm of life. And when they ended, no one noticed, except perhaps the god. Or perhaps the god was already elsewhere, in the flow of the river, in the calendar's new form, in the habits that no longer needed his name. That is the quiet power of these forgotten rituals. They remind us that religion was not once a choice, but a framework. And the myths that supported it were scaffolding, not spectacle. They made the world survivable, predictable, and even when forgotten, they left traces. Not in stories, but in structure. In the sequence of steps followed without knowing why. In the placement of a temple door to catch the first light of dawn. In the naming of months for festivals that are no longer observed. The gods of these rituals may be silent now, but the shape of their influence remains. In broken tablets, in dusty schedules, in bricks that still align with stars. There is something profoundly quiet about a broken tablet. Unlike shattered statues or collapsed temples, which leave behind grandeur in ruins. The tablet, once broken, becomes a whisper. It no longer proclaims, it hints. It gestures toward what was once known, once recited, now lost. And in the great libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, in Nippur, in Nineveh, in Sippar, archaeologists have uncovered not neat collections of literature, but heaps. Piles of clay, crumbling, overlapping, partial. Most contain no myths at all. They are inventories, contracts, school exercises. But scattered among them are fragments of something else. A hymn to a goddess whose name appears nowhere else. A ritual sequence that begins mid-sentence and ends mid-word. A dream omen, cataloged with symbols that resist translation. These are not mysteries in the romantic sense. They are bureaucratic mysteries, traces of systems that outlived their context. Imagine you are a scribe, late in the evening, in a dusty corner of a temple school. You've been told to copy a text, one you've never read before, because it is old and therefore important. You do not understand every word. Some of the names are strange. Some of the instructions contradict what you know, but you copy anyway. Because this is how knowledge survives, not through understanding, but through repetition, and then the tablet is shelved, and perhaps no one reads it again, and yet centuries later it is unearthed. The imprint of your stylus still visible, the unfamiliar God's name still intact, and we, who read it now, try to make sense of what it meant. But we lack the context. The calendar has changed. The river it refers to has shifted course. The social system that gave that God meaning has vanished. And so we guess. We cross-reference, we compare symbols, we propose reconstructions, but the myth remains ghost-like, present but not fully there. And this, in its own way, is beautiful, because it reminds us that belief does not need to be eternal to be meaningful, that a God need not be remembered to have mattered, that even when the chant is lost, the silence that follows carries weight. Some tablets hint at entire cosmologies now vanished. One fragment, found in Mari, speaks of a river below the river, a place of waiting and judgment beneath the visible world. It is not the underworld, as described in later myths. It is something else, a subterranean logic of justice and fertility. Another tablet from Kish lists animals to be sacrificed during the month of Ashes, including a species of bird no longer native to the region. What was this month? What did it commemorate? We don't know. And yet, the birds were caught, the fires lit, the names whispered. Not for us, not for preservation, but for presence. The ritual was its own reason. And so we walk among these traces, not as decoders, but as eavesdroppers. We hear half the conversation. A god asks, we do not hear the question. A priest replies, we lack the language. And still, the dialogue feels real. It is there in the care of the script, in the symmetry of the lines. In the way a single word, perhaps the god's name, is given extra space, extra emphasis, a touch of reverence in the stroke. Even when the meaning is gone, the gesture remains. And it is this gesture, this act of writing something not just for function, but for permanence, that defines the earliest theology. Not faith in the divine, but faith in the record. The gods were written because writing made them last. And now, ironically, the writing has outlived the gods. Their temples have crumbled, but their syllables endure. Etched in clay, unearthed in dust, waiting for meaning to return. But perhaps meaning is not the point. Perhaps it is enough that they were named, that someone once believed they mattered, that a ritual was performed, not for spectacle, but for survival, that a myth was whispered, not for pleasure, but for pattern. In these fragments, we do not find resolution. We find ritual memory, preserved by chance, interpreted by patience. And in a world that moves quickly, where meaning must be immediate, there is something deeply restful about the idea that not all belief must be understood. Some can simply be honored, as structure, as silence, as tablet in the dust. Consider the word myth as it might have meant to someone in Lagash in 2400 BCE, if indeed they had such a word. For them, a myth was not fiction. It was not separate from life. It was a framework for why things were as they were. A king ruled not by charisma, but because the god had selected him. The temple was not rich by corruption, but by divine design. The drought was not random, but the result of a neglected ritual. In this world, narrative and necessity were intertwined. And so the myths we recover from tablets are often not stories in the modern sense. They are diagrams of belief, schematics of society. Take, for example, a recovered sequence from the Temple of Enki in Eridu. It lists a multi-day ritual. Sequence meant to coincide with the turning of the agricultural year. Not a festival, not a feast. A series of invocations, purifications, and offerings conducted in near silence, interrupted only by the sound of reed instruments and footsteps in dust. There is no drama in the text, no central figure. Just a god, a season, and a people hoping for continuity. And that, perhaps, was the point. Myths were not meant to captivate. They were meant to stabilize, to normalize the unpredictable. When the Tigris flooded too early, the story did not shift. The ritual did. Additional offerings were made. Additional gods were invoked. Calendars were revised, but the structure remained. In a sense, it was the ritual, not the belief, that mattered most. One had to do the right thing, even if no one remembered why. And this is why we find so many tablets listing rites without context, gods without myths, procedures without explanation, because the performance itself carried the weight. It is tempting, today, to think of myth as narrative, as something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the myths of the first cities often had no such shape. They were cycles. They began anew with each season. They referred backward to what was always done, always true, and they often ended not with resolution, but with return. The god departs, then returns. The field is barren, then fertile. The moon wanes, then waxes. And so we return to the tablet, to the dust, to the silent knowledge of repetition. What is most remarkable is how these early rituals left no clear trace of their own meaning. In the Temple of Notch, we find evidence of fish offerings conducted at lunar intervals. Why fish? Why the moon? The surviving texts offer no rationale, only the procedure, the kind of fish, the vessel to be used, the position of the priest's hands. This tells us something important, that the why was never the point. The act itself was belief. And this is where modern minds struggle. We seek explanation. They sought alignment. Their gods were not questioned. They were coordinated with, just as water channels were measured, just as stars were tracked, so too were divine requirements charted and met. And when something went wrong, the solution was not philosophical. It was procedural. Rites were redone, debts repaid, purity reestablished, and the city moved on. If a myth disappeared, it was not mourned. Another took its place, or none at all. What mattered was not the poetry, but the pattern. And so the gods who faded into brickwork, Ningirsu, Nanch, Ashki, and others, did not vanish in disgrace. They faded in redundancy. Their rituals absorbed, their names collapsed into broader deities, their festivals canceled by calendar reforms. And yet as we sift through the ruins, we find pieces of them still. A broken incense stand etched with a barely legible name. A priest's robe clasp, engraved with a forgotten symbol. A child's school tablet practicing the signs for a ritual that no longer exists. These are not grand discoveries. They do not rewrite history, but they remind us of something humbler and perhaps more powerful. That belief was once daily, tedious, and embedded. That myth was once as much a part of infrastructure as brick and water. And that the gods of the first cities were real, not because they were great, but because they were there, in every act, in every step, in every season. And that presence, quiet, unremembered, uninterrupted, is what lingers still in the dust. By the time cities like Uruk and Kish reached their full flourish, the divine had become less of a presence and more of an institution. Gods no longer thundered from the sky or whispered from reeds. They issued appointments, assigned quotas, and watched over grain tallies. The divine realm mirrored the civic, and the civic aspired to the divine. The temple was no longer a place of awe alone. It was an office, a storage unit, a court. Its gods had duties now, measured not in miracles, but in daily outcomes. Rainfall, trade success, crop yields. And those gods, once mythic, became administrative. Their stories became titles. Their personalities became jurisdictions. Ningirsu, once storm god and warlord, now oversaw irrigation and field labor. Nanch, once seer of dreams, governed canals and fish distribution. It was not degradation, it was formalization. And with that formalization came permanence, but also forgetfulness. You did not need to love a god to honor them. You simply needed to obey. Obedience was embedded in law, tax, and timekeeping. The calendar revolved around feast days, not for celebration, but for synchronization. On the second day of the month of plowing, offerings must be made, not because of devotion, but because the floodwaters would soon rise and the system required renewal. And so myths that once inspired fear or wonder now served a different role. They reminded people how to behave, when to plant, when to rest. If you were a worker in a state granary in Lagash, your understanding of the gods was not cosmic. It was procedural. You knew which offerings were required for which festivals, which priest received which surplus, which day was marked by silence. You did not question, you followed. And this rhythm of non-questioning gave rise to a new form of myth, the unspoken kind. A myth you didn't know was a myth because it felt like routine. When a child asked, "Why do we not work on the 12th day of the month of dust?" the answer was not a tale of gods. It was because we never do. And so, slowly, belief became structure, and structure became invisible. That is how gods fade. Not through war or heresy, but through assimilation, through the soft, unmarked passage from memory to motion. And yet, if you look closely, traces remain. An ancient storeroom bears the mark of a goddess on its threshold, not for protection, but for protocol. A ledger lists an offering to a deity no longer present because the field still yields. A priest chants a name with no story but perfect pronunciation. The system lives. The myth, perhaps, does not. Or perhaps it does. Not as legend, but as law, as etiquette, as inertia. It is easy to forget that the earliest myths were not about entertainment. They were not meant to astonish, but to orient. To root people in cycles older than kings, more predictable than moods. And so when those myths disappear from tablets, it is not always a sign of collapse. It may be a sign of success. The myth became unnecessary. It had done its work. The temple remained. The rituals continued. The god's name lingered in a shortened form, an epithet, a glyph, and the people moved on. But still, among the broken ruins, we find oddities. A temple door sealed before its time. A storage room containing unused votive statues. A child's name that includes a forgotten deity. These are the whispers of belief in transition. Moments when the old rhythm faltered or paused or shifted. And in those pauses, something tender remains. A recognition that what once mattered deeply can, with time, become invisible, but never meaningless. That in a world where everything moves forward, there is something profoundly human in leaving small tokens behind. Not for gods, not for memory, but simply for continuity. A ring laid at a threshold. A symbol etched into brick. A name half spoken, half lost. These are not grand legacies, but they are human ones. They are how we remember to forget, and how we forget to remember. And in that space, between myth and motion, between dust and intention, the first gods sleep. And so we arrive at the quietest part of all, the aftermath. The myths of the first cities, once embedded in every movement of life, now lie shattered beneath meters of silt and silence. They are no longer spoken, no longer known. Their gods have no worshippers, their temples no caretakers. And yet, as we dig, slowly, carefully, we find them. Not in statues or epic poems, but in routines. In building placements, in drainage systems aligned with solstices, in doorways that open precisely to the east. These are the after-images of belief, not the myths themselves, but the shadows they cast. Consider this. In modern-day Tel Brak, the remains of what was once a vibrant center of cult and commerce reveal a curious pattern. Mounds arranged in a spiral paths that curve inward, leading to what may have been a sacred precinct. No myths remain to explain this design. No texts, no names. But the shape persists. The pattern survives. It tells us something we cannot fully articulate, but intuitively feel. That once people moved here with purpose, that they turned their bodies towards something unseen, something now absent. This is the residue of religion, not dogma, not doctrine, but direction. And we follow it unknowingly every day. In our architecture, in our rituals, even in our language. When we say temple or sanctuary, we echo structures long buried. When we name days after planets, we invoke gods whose myths we have forgotten. And this is how the myths of the first cities live on. Not as stories, but as habits, as defaults, as design choices repeated without knowledge of origin. In this way, myth becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure, in turn, becomes invisible. That, perhaps, is the final transformation of the gods of brick and tablet. Not to vanish, but to dissolve into form. To become the shape of things, the rhythm of repetition. It is tempting to romanticize the loss, to imagine that if only we had the full story, the intact tablet, the complete chant, we could resurrect the belief. But belief was never in the story. It was in the doing, in the walking of the spiral, in the lighting of the incense, in the quiet bow of the head at dawn. These things did not require comprehension, only presence. And so, even now, when we walk among ruins, we participate unknowingly in a continuity. Our breath stirs the same dust once swept from altars. Our footsteps follow lines laid down in devotion. Our awe, quiet, reverent, unspoken, mirrors theirs. We are not so different. They, too, lived in uncertainty. They, too, sought rhythm in chaos. And in the absence of answers, they built rituals. They named gods. They shaped stories to hold the formlessness of life. And now those stories are gone. Or not gone. Simply unread. Simply buried. Waiting, perhaps, not to be revived, but to be acknowledged. To be honored, not by belief, but by attention. By noticing the trace of a god's name on a wall fragment. By pausing at the symmetry of an ancient court. By listening, not for voices, but for patterns, for echoes, for the soft hum of continuity beneath the noise. And so we leave the tablets, not with understanding, but with stillness, with a kind of restful humility, knowing that not all knowledge must be complete to be meaningful, that the first myths were not instructions, but invitations to live with order, to walk with reverence, to name what we cannot grasp. And though the tablets are cracked, though the myths are dust, the gesture remains. And that, in the end, may be enough. Now, as the dust settles once more in your imagination, and the last fragments of ancient brick slip gently from your thoughts, let us take a final walk through the world we've just uncovered. We have not chased battles. We have not recited epics. We've simply paused long enough, quietly enough, to notice the shapes of belief that once held entire civilizations together. And those shapes were never loud. They were patterns carved into routine. They were not shouted in hymns, but whispered in measurements. The god did not descend in fire, but arrived in the number of barley sacks, in the tilt of the roof, in the silence that followed sunset. Think of the first priest architect, measuring a temple foundation not with inspiration, but with obligation, aligning each wall not to impress, but to fulfill. Behind him, perhaps, stood a boy, his apprentice, unaware of the myth he was constructing. And yet, day by day, brick by brick, they built a world where the divine was not believed in, but lived with. We do not know the boy's name. We do not know the god's full story. But we can feel the quiet connection between them in the angle of a step, the preserved corner of a wall, the strange consistency in placement across hundreds of miles. It tells us something mattered. Something was remembered enough to repeat. And in that repetition, the divine found its home. In your own life, perhaps there are such repetitions, small habitual acts whose origin you've forgotten. A way you greet the morning, a rhythm to how you walk certain stairs, a pause before sleep. These two are myths, not in content, but in function. They are your alignment with the unknown. And this, ultimately, is what the first cities teach us. That myth is not separate from the mundane. It is the mundane, shaped and repeated until it holds meaning, until it calms chaos, until it becomes enough. And so we leave the temples of Girsu and Eridu. We set down the tablets, cracked, unfinished, and still resonant. We brush away the dust, not to erase, but to make space. For silence, for breath, for rest. The gods do not ask to be revived. They ask only to be acknowledged. And we have done that, gently, steadily, without waking the world too much. Now let their rhythms echo in your own, not as belief, not as story, but as softness, as a settling, as sleep. The first cities no longer stand, but their patterns do. And you, listener, dreamer, quiet traveler in time, have walked those patterns tonight. You have wandered their courts. You have read their lost lines. You have paused where once others did. And now, as the myths dissolve back into silence, you are free to drift, not away from them, but into them, into their calm, into their dust, into their remembering. Let go. Rest. The story has ended, but the pattern remains. In this final segment, we enter the sacred silence of a city long forgotten, but once luminous with ritual. Your city of ziggurats, moonlight rites, and endless incense. But we will not gaze up at the temple this time. We will linger beneath it, in its shadow. In the daily steps of the priest who wakes before the sun to tend to gods who no longer speak, whose eyes are carved from lapis, whose presence must be maintained not through miracles, but through maintenance. This is not a story of grandeur. It is not the tale of gods. It is the reality of service, a role passed from father to son, from older initiate to younger apprentice. What did it mean to live inside holiness? To wake each day inside a space that was not yours, but never truly separate. Being a priest in Yor was not a dream of divine communion. It was a life of labor, rhythm, silence, and observation. Every action, from the folding of robes to the pouring of oil, was not just a task. It was a statement, a form of cosmic grammar. We often think of priests as powerful, but here, in Yor power came from disappearing into process. To serve a god was to vanish behind the veil of perfection, to become part of the ritual rather than its architect. In this segment, we will follow that quiet life, through the dawn rites, the ritual baths, the burning of reeds, the endless memorization of lines meant not to be interpreted, but to be repeated. You will walk in sandals that must not touch dirt. You will eat in silence. You will sleep in quarters close to divinity, but always apart. And you will begin to understand that holiness, at its most enduring, is not awe, but repetition. Let us begin. The first sound you hear each morning is not a chant, not the murmur of worshipers, not even the call of birds. It is the steady brushing of reeds against stone, your own hands sweeping the temple threshold before the sun rises, before the city stirs. You are not meant to be seen yet. The streets of Yor are still dark, quiet, but never silent. Somewhere, a distant herder is guiding animals to water. Somewhere, a market stall is being unfolded in preparation for the day's trade. But you are already at work, a priest, though few would call you that aloud. In Sumerian, your title means something closer to one who tends, one who prepares, one who keeps things in order. Your robe is plain today. The fine ceremonial garb is for feasts, for public rituals. This is not such a day. This is an ordinary day, which means there is much to do. You begin with water, the most sacred substance of all, not because of purity alone, but because it carries memory. The priests before you used it. The gods before them received it. And now you carry it from the basin to the altar, not spilling a drop, not stepping off the path. Every movement is deliberate. There is no haste in holiness. The temple itself is not massive by today's standards, a set of raised courtyards and thick brick halls. But it looms in your awareness. Not just a place, but a presence. You do not walk beneath its shadow casually. You move with the pace of ritual, the steadiness of someone who believes not in spectacle, but in rhythm. You light the oil lamps in order, north to south, then east to west. Never the reverse. You speak the invocation softly, not for the god's ears, which no longer seem to hear, but for your own. To remember, to repeat, to maintain the line between before and now. And as the flames catch, flickering across the faces of carved idols, Inanna, Nena, Enki, you feel no surge of emotion, no divine encounter. What you feel is continuity. You are the next link in a chain that is not meant to be broken, even if the stories have faded. Even if the city no longer believes as it once did. The gods do not ask for belief. They ask for attention, for rhythm, for presence. That is what you give, and in return, you are allowed to remain. In the inner sanctum, in the ritual spaces where others may not go. Not because you are more sacred, but because you are more practiced. You have learned when to speak and when to remain silent. You have memorized the offerings. Grain, beer, incense, milk, each with its place, its measure, its phrasing. You have learned how to clean an altar without turning your back on it. How to step through doorways with your left foot first. How to wait. Most of your time is spent waiting, not in boredom, but in readiness. The temple breathes on its own schedule. Sometimes a festival approaches, and the halls fill with song, and you must guide acolytes in their duties, ensuring that each movement unfolds without disruption. Other times, like today, the temple is quiet, and your labor is maintenance. Not of structure, but of sanctity. You wash the sacred vessels. You check the seals on the grain jars. You trim the wicks. You note the calendar carved into baked clay, marking not days, but events. The waxing of the moon, the rising of certain stars, the sacred times for offerings, and always you prepare. You do not improvise. The gods are not amused by spontaneity. They are honored through repetition, through the same phrases spoken at the same times, in the same tones. It is not a burden. It is a relief. To know what comes next. To surrender your ego to the structure of service. Even your meals follow a pattern, consumed alone or in silence. No garlic, no onions, no coarse foods that might offend divine senses. You are not forbidden from joy, but your joy must be internal. Measured, offered back to the rhythm that shapes your day. You are not rich. You are not powerful. The merchants of your hold more silver than you. The scribes, perhaps, more fame. But you walk in spaces they cannot. You tend to altars that remember more than any man. And when the sun reaches its height and the city hums around the ziggurat's base, you are inside its walls, adjusting the angle of a basin, sweeping the threshold again, repeating the chant you learned as a child. Not because you believe it will change the world, but because it keeps the world from slipping. And in the long silence between words, you begin to understand. This is what it means to live in the shadow of the temple. The heat of the day arrives not with violence, but inevitability. The temple's high walls trap warmth as they trap memory, and by midday, the inner corridors breathe heavy with stillness. You move more slowly now, not from fatigue, but out of respect. For the silence, for the past, for the subtle shift that occurs when light filters down at sharper angles. Outside, the city of your pulses with commerce, with noise, with bartering. But you remain inside the cool stone, where the rhythm of the sacred still governs your every step. You are not cut off from the world. You are embedded in it differently. Through service, through preservation. There are visitors sometimes, petitioners. Those who bring small offerings. A jug of oil, a carved figurine, a clay tablet inscribed with wishes. They are not permitted past the outer courtyard. You meet them briefly, quietly. You receive their tokens not with ceremony, but with acknowledgement. Their prayers are not yours to answer. That task lies with the gods, and the gods, as ever, remain silent. Your duty is to carry the requests forward, to place them in the shrine, to ensure they do not go unheard. Even if no reply comes, you do this with care. Not because you believe each request is meaningful, but because belief is not the measure. Consistency is. One day, a mother brings barley in a woven basket. She does not speak. She only bows, and you nod, and she leaves. You do not know her name. You do not know her grief. But you carry the barley to the altar just the same. Set it beside the others. Whisper the name of the goddess it is meant for, and then let it rest. This is the nature of your role, to be intermediary, but also to be invisible, to fade behind the action, to allow the ritual to shine through you, not because of you. When the outer gates close at dusk, the temple becomes something else, a space outside of time. You walk its corridors with oil lamps in hand, the flicker of flame bouncing off walls smoothed by centuries of similar footsteps. You know every corner, every discoloration in the brick, every groove where a former priest rested his hand. And yet it never becomes ordinary. The stillness deepens at night. Not with menace, but with weight. The gods do not sleep. You do, but only briefly. You lie on a thin mat near the eastern chamber, where the moonlight sometimes falls through the lattice in thin lines across your chest. You wake often, not to sound, but to presence. To the awareness that you are not alone, not in a haunted sense, but in a held one. The gods are not watching you, but the space is remembering you, and you, in turn, are learning to remember it. You do not dream vividly. You do not long for visions. You rest in the same rhythm as your waking hours, steady, unremarkable, unbroken. And when the stars shift and dawn begins its slow approach, you rise again. There are no weekends, no holidays from Divinity. Every day must be maintained. You rinse your hands, you dress, you step back into the rhythm. The temple is both cradle and cage, a place of deep familiarity and of constant demand. You are not asked to question. You are asked to perform, to embody, to transmit. Even the words you speak are not yours. They are memorized, inherited, repeated. And in that repetition, you find something close to freedom, not from obligation, but from confusion. You know what to do. You know how to do it. And in a world where the gods no longer speak, that knowledge is enough. Occasionally, you are joined by younger priests, apprentices, initiates. They move with uncertainty, with eagerness, with the desire to understand. You do not explain much. Explanation is not the method here. Observation is. They learn by watching you, by matching your steps, by correcting their posture, by memorizing the order of vessels, the sequence of chants. And slowly, over weeks, months, years, they disappear into the rhythm too. That is how the temple survives. Not through inscription, through imitation, through proximity, through time. You sometimes wonder what will become of the temple when you are gone. When your hands no longer tend the altars, when your breath no longer carries the chants. But then you see the initiate light, the lamp without guidance. Bow at the correct angle. Wipe the idol with a cloth that's already folded in thirds, and you know you are not the last. You are only the next. And that is all you ever needed to be. Outside the temple, your changes with the seasons. Merchants arrive from distant lands, their tongues strange, their cargo even stranger. The river swells, then recedes. Markets bloom with dates and dried fish, then with ceramics and copper. Festivals come and go. Emperors rise and fall. But the temple remains, not untouched, but unchanged in essence. Its bricks weather, its plaster chips, but its purpose never shifts. And within it, you continue. Not because you are frozen in time, but because your time is shaped by repetition. To live as a priest in Yor is to surrender ambition in favor of presence. You do not rise through ranks in a worldly sense. You are not promoted by praise or demoted by failure. Your success is measured in continuity. Did the ritual proceed as it always has? Were the lamps lit in the right order? Did you forget the offering phrase? Your life is composed of thousands of such moments, small acts that no one sees but the temple itself. And the temple, though mute, remembers. It remembers through habit. Through wear. Through the smoothness of a stone that has been touched the same way for generations. And you are part of that memory now. In the middle hours of the day, when the sun scorches the courtyards and the outer city grows noisy, you tend to the records. Not the grand tablets of kings and conquests, but the ritual logs. You note which offerings were made, which chants recited, which festival preparations begun. You do not interpret. You do not comment. You record. The gods, after all, need witnesses, not editors. In the temple's northern chamber lies the archive, a modest room lined with shelves, filled with clay tablets baked hard by time. You run your fingers over them sometimes, not reading, but recognizing. Each one written by hands like yours, eyes like yours, lives shaped by the same rhythms. You are not original, and that is your peace. One afternoon, as you kneel to reset a water basin, you feel a breeze through the high slit of a ventilation shaft. Rare welcome. And with it comes dust. Dust that settles gently on your shoulder, your brow, your hands. You do not brush it away. You let it rest as a kind of blessing. This dust is older than cities. It has passed through temples before. It will pass through them again. It knows the silence you keep. It knows the prayer beneath the motion. And in a way, it becomes part of the offering. A reminder that nothing in this temple is ever truly clean, ever truly isolated. Even in sacred space, the world intrudes. And that too is holy. Later, a senior priest speaks briefly with you. Not in reprimand, not in instruction, but in quiet acknowledgement. A single phrase, the rhythm is holding. That is all he says. That is all he needs to say. Because you understand, because you feel it too. The rhythm is not just a series of tasks. It is a pulse that you join, a beat that you become. And when that rhythm falters, when a chant is delayed, when a vessel is misplaced, the temple feels it. Not angrily, but with weight. With a kind of ache, like a pause in breathing. So you guard it. You protect the rhythm the way a musician protects tempo. Not with pride, but with care. You become sensitive to it, aware of its subtle shifts, aware of what strengthens it and what disturbs it. And you learn over years how to adapt without disrupting, how to carry the pattern forward even when others around you change. New faces arrive. Younger priests, some from distant towns. They bring unfamiliar habits, different dialects. But in the temple, they must conform to the rhythm. They must learn your pace, your tone, your silence. You do not impose, you simply demonstrate. And slowly, the rhythm absorbs them too. This is not assimilation. It is transmission. The way fire passes from one lamp to another. No flame lost, only spread. And so the temple grows. Not in size, but in memory, in continuation, in fidelity. In the still center of the city, amid dust and sun and the ever-turning wheel of time, you remain, a priest not by calling, but by consistency. A servant not of doctrine, but of detail. A keeper not of faith, but of form. And in that keeping, you find your place, your peace, your permanence. There are days when the temple seems quieter than usual, when the usual rhythm is more of a hush than a chant, more breath than sound. On these days, your steps feel lighter, not because your duties are fewer, but because your body has absorbed the sequence so fully that it no longer feels like labor. It is something else now, a form of embodiment, as if your limbs themselves were shaped by ritual. You no longer need to count the steps between the outer courtyard and the inner chamber. Your feet already know them. You no longer need to glance down to ensure the offering bowl is balanced in your hand. Your fingers hold it with instinct, honed by repetition. These quiet days reveal something subtle. That devotion, when lived consistently, becomes indistinguishable from identity. You are not playing the part of a priest. Owa, you are a priest. Not because of belief, but because of behavior. In the afternoon, the scribes arrive. Not for you, but for the gods. They set their tools beside low stone tables and begin their copying. Hymns. Lists genealogies of divine beings whose names few still speak aloud. You do not disturb them, but you pass close enough to see the fresh wedges pressed into soft clay, each one precise, intentional. They are not writing for an audience. They are writing for continuity, for the next fire, the next flood, the next empire that will find these tablets buried and wonder who once spoke these names. You find that comforting? Not because it means you will be remembered, but because it means the structure UVA served may outlast you. You once feared being forgotten. Now you welcome it, so long as the rhythm continues. And the rhythm is everywhere. In the oil lamp, you relight just before dusk. In the basin, you rinse for the third time today. In the hum of a chant that no longer means anything to you linguistically, but resonates like a lullaby all the same. Occasionally, you assist in larger ceremonies. These are rare, for festival days only, and they bring disruption along with them. More people, more preparation, more noise. But the same underlying structure persists. Offerings are made, chants are spoken. Processions wind through the temple's narrow paths. You do not lead them. You support them. You ensure the water is ready, the incense is placed, the vessels are clean. Your name is not announced. You are not applauded, but the ceremony unfolds as it should. And that is your reward. You watch children wide-eyed at the towering statues. You see elders bow with practiced movements. You hear, in their voices, echoes of the rhythm you've known for decades, and you return to your duties with renewed steadiness. This is not passion, it is not awe. It is deeper. A kind of slow, ancient patience, older than memory, deeper than belief. There is comfort in this stillness. In being surrounded by walls that do not change, by tasks that do not rush, by language that does not bend to modern convenience. In the temple, you are never asked to improvise, never pressured to innovate. You are asked only to do what has been done, and to do it with care. Even as the world outside grows more chaotic, the temple endures. You hear whispers of war, of changes in the palace, of strange foreigners arriving by boat. But these things pass like wind over stone. You acknowledge them, and then return to the altar. Because the gods, or at least their spaces, require tending. And you have chosen to tend them, not for glory, not for certainty, but for rhythm. And that rhythm, once embraced, carries you more surely than any doctrine ever could. Sometimes you wonder how many others have stood exactly where you stand now. How many sandals have tapped the same patch of temple floor? How many breaths have been drawn before the same altar? How many hands have folded the same cloth over the offering table? How many voices have echoed down the same narrow corridor with the same unchanging chant? You will never know their names. Most have not been recorded. They were not kings or warriors or poets. They were, like you, custodians of rhythm. And that, you've come to realize, is enough. Because the temple was not built to celebrate individuals. It was built to serve something larger than memory, larger than time. And you are part of that largeness, not by standing out, but by blending in. Your duties continue, unremarkable but unbroken. You tend to the gods' garments which are not truly worn, but must still be cleaned and folded with reverence. You refill the sacred oils thick with scent, which must always be ready even though they may never be used. You dust statues that have not moved in centuries, wipe surfaces touched only by ceremonial air, and sweep stone floors where no common feet are allowed to step. You prepare spaces for presence, not for use. This too is service. And though you may sometimes question whether the gods notice, whether they exist in the way you were once told, the rhythm itself quiets those questions. Because even without answers, the practice remains meaningful. One evening, as you rinse the last bowl and extinguish the final flame, you pause beneath the open archway that leads to the western wall. The sun is just slipping below the edge of the city, casting the bricks in tones of copper and ash. You stand still. You let the silence fill your ears. And in that moment, you feel not enlightened, but anchored, grounded not by vision, but by repetition. This is the hidden beauty of the priest's life. Not ecstasy, but certainty. Not revelation, but steadiness. Not triumph, but texture. There are no climaxes here, only continuities. You know that others outside this temple live by different rhythms, ones driven by commerce, ambition, war. But here, in the sacred hush of Ur's temple, your rhythm is cyclical, slow, deliberate. A year passes, then another. Festivals return. Apprentices grow older. You grow quieter. The lines of your face deepen not from worry, but from weather, from standing at the temple threshold in all seasons, from rising before the sun and retiring long after it has set. One day, an old priest who once trained you is no longer present. He has not been replaced. His mat remains in the corner for some time, undisturbed, and then it too is gone. His name is not spoken aloud, but his motions live on in yours, in the way you measure grain, in the manner you fold a robe. The temple keeps memory, not through monuments, but through motions. This is legacy in its softest form. One evening, as a storm begins to gather over the city, you move through the temple with lantern in hand. The air smells of distant rain, of earth ready to receive. You light each lamp carefully, shielding the flame from drafts. And as you do, you think of the storms that have come before, of winds that have howled outside these walls, of floods that have tested their foundation, of empires that have claimed your, then lost it again. The temple remains because of its walls, because of its rituals, because of people like you, not famous, not loud, but present, unwavering. That night, as the first drops begin to fall and the air thickens with the scent of wet brick, you rest on your mat with unusual calm. The gods may not answer. The chants may never change. The duties may never end. But there is a kind of holiness in that too, in doing what must be done again and again, not for reward, but for rightness. You close your eyes, you listen to the rain, and you breathe in the quiet confidence of a life fully given to something that cannot be held, only continued. As the seasons cycle once more, you begin to notice small changes in the temple, not in the rituals themselves, but in how they are carried. The youngest apprentices move with just a hint more confidence. A chant that once faltered now flows smoothly from newer lips. A robe is folded with the proper crease without instruction. And you realize the rhythm you once inherited you have now passed on. Not by force, not even by teaching, but by example, by being there, by showing up every day and doing things the old way until others began to echo you without even realizing they were doing it. This, you now know, is what keeps the temple alive, not the statues or the hymns, not the smoke or the symbols, but the quiet continuity of motion. You begin to speak less, not out of tiredness, but because words have become less necessary. The rhythm speaks louder. You smile when others intuit what needs to be done. You nod quietly when they place the vessel in the exact spot you would have chosen. You watch, with a kind of serene detachment, as your presence dissolves into the larger process. You are no longer a guide. You are a current, a flow that others join, then carry forward. And this, more than any title or reward, brings you peace. The temple, of course, remains the same. Its bricks are patched here and there, its plaster renewed. But its bones, those massive sacred stones, stand just as they always have. Each step you take across them carries the weight of generations, and you feel lighter, not heavier, for it. You move with greater ease now, not because the work has lessened, but because your body has become the work. Your breath aligns with the pace of rituals. Your waking thoughts begin not with yourself, but with the day's first duty. You rise without alarm, move without rush, rest without need for entertainment. The world outside seems louder than before, more chaotic, more insistent. You hear stories of war and shifting alliances, of gods abandoned and new ones erected. You nod, but you do not react. The temple has taught you something deeper. That noise fades, but rhythm endures, and so you remain. One evening, a novice asks you why you do not seek retirement, why you do not wish to return to your family home or pursue another life, now that your hair has grayed and your hands stiffen with age. You think for a moment and then simply reply, because I am not finished. Not because there is something left to achieve, but because the rhythm still holds you. You are still part of the pulse. And until the moment it no longer welcomes your step, you will continue. There is no exit ceremony for a priest in Yor. There is no grand final chant, no farewell offering. There is only one more lamp to light, one more basin to clean, one more day to prepare the sacred space for a God who may or may not still linger. And that is enough. When you finally do fall ill, the temple does not stop. Another priest steps in. The chants are still sung, the offerings still made. And in your small chamber, beneath a narrow window, you listen to the rhythm continue without you. And you are comforted. Because the rhythm is stronger than any one man. Because you were never meant to be its master, only its keeper, for a time. In those last days, you reflect not on visions or revelations, not on mystical encounters or divine whispers. You remember the texture of the stone beneath your fingers, the smell of the incense before the morning chant, the silence just before dusk when the city's noise fades and the temple seems to breathe. You remember the faces of others, some forgotten, some still present. You remember not their words, but their gestures. The way one turned a lamp just so, the way another placed offerings with both hands. You remember the rhythm in all its forms. And when your breath grows shallow and your sight dims, you do not fear, because the temple remains. The bricks still hold heat. The lamps still burn. The chants still echo. And you were part of that, not forever, but long enough, and in the sacred hush of Yor, as the moon rises and the city sleeps. Another priest lights a lamp in your honor, not with fanfare, but with quiet reverence. He does not speak your name, but he walks your path, and the rhythm, unbroken, moves forward.